Before we apply the pivot and unpivot feature in our project, it's again time for some theory first. How does pivoting and unpivoting work? Let's have a look at a simple example. Here we have a table, a query you could say. This just contains of 4 columns. We have the product column with 2 products, apple and banana, and we have data for 3 years, 18, 19 and 20, and the values in these columns basically represent, let's say, the amount of products you sold. So in 18 we sold 10 apples and 23 bananas. Not a lot, but it's not about that. What's more important here is that you could change the structure of this table, because if you consider the first column being named product, it might make more sense to reduce the amount of columns here, because actually we could make our table a bit more descriptive if we would have one column being named year with the corresponding years for each product, and another column with the corresponding number of products sold for the corresponding year. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say we select these 3 columns, 18, 19 and 20. Then we could turn these columns into one single column, which would then be a so-called attribute. This information right here would be the, values. So we could basically turn these 3 columns and that information into a so-called attribute value pair. Now this sounds a bit abstract here, but if you do something like this, so if you reduce the amount of columns from many columns to 2 columns, so to an attribute value pair, well, then the result would look something like this, and then you would unpivot your information. And if you look at the result in the lower table now, you can see that all our single columns became now part of this attribute column, and the corresponding values, became part of the value column. As you can also see in the left part of the lower table, we now have more rows because, for all the years we initially had in multiple columns, these are now displayed in one single column, therefore we have to add this information. But generally, we can improve the structure a lot with this unpivot feature. By the way, you can of course also rename attribute and value to the corresponding information stored in the column. Here, attribute would be the year, for example, value could be the number of products sold. And more importantly, you can also revert this change. So you can also turn it back to the initial state. This process would then be called pivoting. So this is pivoting and unpivoting in a little example. Let's now apply this concept also in our project. So I'm back in our project file in the population combined query, and now I would like to have a look at the columns, and I would like to see where we can apply the unpivot or the pivot feature. So now talking about the columns, I guess the first columns right here are alright, but we should work on this population male, female and total structure here. Because the population total is actually redundant information, because if you have the male and the female population, then you can calculate the total population easily. Therefore, to keep our data model, our data set in the end as lean as possible, we should delete this column. We know how this works. We can simply right-click it and remove it. So this was step 1, but now with this reduced amount of columns, we can also dive into pivoting or unpivoting, because here, population male and population female is kind of information we could also store in a different structure in these attribute value pairs I just talked about. This would not reduce the amount of columns in this case. We would still have 2 columns, so one with the population in this case and the second one with the corresponding population count, but the structure would be easier to understand in our data model. Therefore, unpivoting right here would be something I would recommend. Now, how does this work? Well, as you saw in the theory example, I selected multiple columns, but generally unpivoting would also work by selecting a single column, for example, the population male column here. Now, to access the unpivot feature, which we need in this case, we can go to the transform ribbon, and here in the any column area, we have that unpivot columns feature. If you click onto the arrow next to this button, you got 3 options. The first one, unpivot columns or unpivot only selected columns, to be honest, is basically the same functionality. What it means, or what both mean, is that you will unpivot the currently selected columns. Unpivot other columns would mean that you unpivot all columns but the currently selected one. Now in our case, we want to unpivot the currently selected column, so we can either choose the first or the third option. I'll go with the third option, for example, and if I click onto this button now, you can see the female population was of course untouched, but here we now created two new columns. As we saw it on the theory slide, we now have an attribute column, which consists of the initial column name, and we have a corresponding value column, which now contains the actual values that were stored in the initial population male column. Now, an important thing you saw already here is that unpivoting is possible with a single column, as shown right here, and with multiple columns, as shown on the theory slides. Now, in this case, I guess unpivoting a single column doesn't lead to any kind of reasonable information. Therefore, we should undo this step. What we can do here is, of course, we can click onto this X, or we can use the pivot feature, as I showed it to you on the theory slide. Now, to apply pivot, you have to select one single column only in this case, so we will select this attribute column. Now we go back to the transform ribbon, and here we now go to pivot column. Important at this stage, unpivoting columns is possible with one or multiple columns. Pivoting columns is only possible with one single column. Therefore, we will now select pivot column. And here in this menu, we can now select the corresponding values that should be stored in this newly created column. Because what we do in the end right here is we turn this two columns here, in our case attribute and value, back to one single column. Population male will be the column in the end. And the values that should be stored in this population male column are the values. Therefore, we have to select the value column here in this menu. By the way, the advanced options would allow us to define the aggregation of the values in this corresponding value column here. Aggregation will be covered later throughout the course. Therefore, we'll just keep the advanced options as they are and press OK. Now this can take a few seconds. And now we see that we got our population male column back. By the way, in case you're wondering about the changed sorting order, because if I scroll to the left, you can see we now got Afghanistan here, and then it's sorted by country and then by the year in the end. This was applied automatically by Power BI now due to the new column we created here. Don't worry about that at this stage. We will have a look at sorting again and maybe at reorganizing our project in one of the next lectures. For the moment, let's focus on pivoting and unpivoting. Another thing here is that we got our initial data back, but actually we wanted to turn the population male and female column into this new attribute value pair. For this, we now select both columns. We go back to the transform ribbon and here to unpivot columns. And now we can select either unpivot columns or unpivot only selected columns. As I said, both in the end lead to the same result. So let's now use unpivot columns maybe. Now this again takes a few seconds. But now we get the desired result. As you can see, we again got our attribute value pairs here, but now we have the attributes which contain the female and the male population. This means we again added additional rows to our data table here, because, well, we need data for the female and the male population now, but that's totally fine, as I already explained, because this improves the readability and the structure of our data model. What we should do though here is we should rename both our columns. We learned how this works already, so we can either double click it, or as we are now in the transform ribbon, we can also press rename right here. This is also possible. And I think a fitting name for the attribute column here would be the gender, maybe, right? This is the female or male population. And for our value, let's again use the rename feature here. This should be the corresponding population. So this was another important step towards our final dataset that we want to use. With that, we again improve the structure. And what we can also see here is that we have this red and white bar here below many of our columns, which typically shows us that we have an error in our data. Here, this is just due to the fact that we kind of changed the structure a lot of our population combined query. To easily get rid of this, you can just select another query, for example, the third one here. As you can see here, everything is all right. If you then go back to the population combined query, it should get rebuilt and reloaded, and then we should get rid of this error. Let's wait a few seconds to see whether this works. Yes, now this looks fine. As I said, this typically refers to an error, but here in this project, we didn't cause any big problems. Therefore, this is just a little bug Power BI Desktop sometimes shows. With that, I want to remind you to save your project from time to time. We learned how this works already, so you can click onto this save symbol up here and now press apply later to make sure your current status is saved. And additionally, we should work on the gender column in the next lecture, because here we have the gender, but this should actually be female and male and not population male. So let's learn how we can split columns as a next step.